This conference is called Challenging the Consensus, and I'd like to sort of explore a little bit about what that consensus really is, because I think if you stand back and you look back over the War on Terror, 11 years after it was launched, there's no question that the War on Terror has been utterly discredited. It's not only failed in its own terms, it didn't fight terrorism, it spread and fueled terrorism from the start. It didn't only discredit and undermine and explode the myth of Western privilege and exceptionalism on the question of human rights with its campaigns of torture and kidnapping and illegal detention that Victoria was talking about in particular. It wasn't only and hasn't only been a disaster, an absolute catastrophe for the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, whose invasions and occupations were, of course, at the center of the War on Terror. But even for those states who launched it, principally the United States and its ally Britain, rather than exposing and displaying the extent of American military imperial power, it exposed the limits of that power and its inability, the inability of the United States and its allies to impose their will on peoples who are prepared to fight back in their own defense. And I think that's really, that amounts to a strategic defeat, even if a qualified one, for the United States in the last 10 years, and is really a profound shift in world power politics that has taken place as a result of that. And I saw that yesterday, even Paddy Ashdown, who is always gung-ho for a fight, the former viceroy of Bosnia, and he was lined up at one time to be the governor of some kind of Afghanistan under NATO occupation. Even he has admitted that the game is up, that Afghanistan is a disaster, a defeat, and that troops must be withdrawn immediately. So the other side of that story is that the opponents of the War on Terror, and that includes obviously the Stop the War Coalition, but many other people besides, have been utterly vindicated by the events of the last 11 years. We argued that this was a war that would lead to an increase in terrorism, the spread of terrorism, fueling of terrorism, including here, that it would fail to subdue the people of Afghanistan and Iraq, that resistance in Iraq and Afghanistan would continue until foreign troops were ejected, and that it would indeed lead to a bloodbath and a cesspit of destruction. Now, there's not a consensus in support of the War on Terror. If anything, globally, there's a consensus against it, including public opinion here in Britain and across the NATO countries. But of course, it's the opposite in the bulk of the media, as people have been talking about on the platform already, and in the political class. And in particular, in the early years of the War on Terror, it's been the utter and complete diametrical opposite of everything that has turned out to be the case. Now, the book that I've just done, The Revenge of History, was mentioned just now, and it's effectively you could say a counter-narrative or an alternative history of the past decade. And when I was preparing it, I was going back over many of the things that were said in the early years of the War on Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. And if you rewind to the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the beginning of the War on Terror, it's like being transported into a sort of toxic parallel universe. And go back to those initial months. Michael Gove, who was now Coalition Education Secretary, a great hero of the Tory right, he was then a columnist. He denounced anyone who questioned what was going on, including at that time at The Guardian, for allowing some kind of debate about what had taken place and whether there should be, in fact, an invasion of Afghanistan at all, as being a Prada-Meinhof group of fifth columnists. We were denounced at the time, opponents of the war and what was taking place were said to be the fascist left of anti-Americanism. Robert Harris, the novelist, who was then an intimate of Tony Blair, and a great supporter of New Labour. He rather fell out with him later, so anyone who's seen the film or read the book The Ghost will know. But at that time he said that we were a babble of idiots, the opponents of the War on Terror, and that we failed to understand that the War on Terror was a rerun of the war against Adolf Hitler. And if you then look at remind yourselves of what happened at the time of the fall of the Taliban from their regime in Kabul. It was said at the time throughout the media and the political class across the Western world have said that this was a great liberation. It was particularly a liberation, emancipation of Afghan women. They were throwing off their burqas, kites were flying, democracy was breaking out, liberation was at hand. And Tony Blair at that time in December 2001 issued a statement, a denunciation of 10 media views that were wrong. That the tiny minority of people who had opposed in the media the war on terror and the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, we had, he said, proved to be wrong. And I'm proud to say that I was one of those singled out who has proved to be wrong. Now, 11 years later, it's quite obvious who has proved to be wrong, and it was Tony Blair, not those people who were challenging him. It was the media and political elites, not those people, including in the Stop the War Coalition, who were opposing what was going on. It's interesting that Paddy Ashdown has finally come round to our view, because the same month he wrote an article in the Times saying that people who said that the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan would lead to a prolonged guerrilla war against the occupation forces were fanciful. It was going to be finished by the end of the year. And when I reminded him of this in a debate in his former constituency of Yeovil, he denied having said it. I had to pull out the article to show him what had actually been said at the time. Of course, 5 years later, we had some sort of rerun of that with John Reid, who was then the Defence Secretary, the new Labour Defence Secretary, who said British troops were being sent to Helmand and he hoped they'd be able to leave without a single shot being fired. Now, tens of millions of rounds later, and hundreds of deaths, and hundreds of British deaths, and thousands of Afghan deaths, we know exactly how ludicrous and how unspeakably wrong that was. And of course, throughout that period, the bulk of the media has echoed the politicians' positions that I've been remembering. Now, there was, of course, a bit more criticism in the run-up to the Iraq War in the media, a bit more challenge. But as Peter and others have been saying, the disinformation that was recycled through the media as fact about weapons of mass destruction is truly unspeakable on the basis of not just flimsy intelligence claims, but pure disinformation and lies which were just published as fact throughout that period in the run-up to the attack. And of course, I don't know if people remember, but Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the US Defense Secretary, said as the American and British troops tore down the barriers and marched into Iraq that the war would be over in 6 days. And Tony Blair said that more people were dying under Saddam Hussein's rule every year in Iraq than would die in the entire invasion and occupation by British and American forces. Now, in the last year of the Saddam regime, the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty estimated that perhaps 200 people were killed by the regime. And of course, in the years of the war on terror and the invasion and occupation, hundreds of thousands have died. We don't know the real figure, but certainly hundreds of thousands. So, of course, there is no credence whatever to what these people said and what was regaled and recycled through the media. They said again that there would be no guerrilla resistance force. We said the opposite, and we were vindicated. Now, the media was certainly worse over Iraq in the United States, but look back at some of the things that were said by people here, including, for example, Andy Marr on the BBC News on the night of the fall of Baghdad, where he went on BBC News and said that once again Tony Blair had been proven right and his critics had been proven wrong.
I don't think anybody after this is going to be able to say of Tony Blair that he's somebody who is driven by the drift of public opinion or focus groups or opinion polls. He took all of those on. He said that they would be able to take Baghdad without a bloodbath and that in the end the Iraqis would be celebrating. And on both of those points he has been proved conclusively right, and it would be entirely ungracious, even for his critics, not to acknowledge that tonight he stands as a larger man and a stronger Prime Minister.
Now, actually, public opinion even then was opposed to the war on terror, but this media coverage and the propaganda that was fed out at the time, I think, helped to weaken the opposition and made the invasion and occupation easier. Of course, being proved right is not enough. And the fact that the war on terror has been discredited and had to be rebranded as overseas contingency operations when Barack Obama came to power, doesn't mean that it's ended. And of course, in fact, it's been escalated and rebranded in a new way and taken in new directions. First of all, we've had the escalation of drone attacks, which have killed thousands of people in Pakistan alone, including probably more than 1,000 civilians. We don't know. We've seen the rise of a new, revived form of liberal interventionism or humanitarian intervention in the last couple of years. And the key to it is the idea there mustn't be too many boots on the ground, because that was the problem with Iraq and Afghanistan. You've got to be seen to be targeting the bad guys. You've got to be seen to be saving civilians and in the fight for freedom again. It's a bit of a sort of rewind to the Kosovo War and the story that was told at the time. These wars now, to be successful, they've got the new form of the war on terror, the new rebranded war on terror, has to be seen to be arm's length, proxy wars. And of course, the Arab uprisings have provided the mechanism and the opening for the new form of the war on terror to be pushed forward. And first of all, we saw it happen in Libya. Now, the intervention, the NATO intervention in Libya, which is the first step in the new war on terror, we were told it was a war, an intervention to protect civilians. And as a result of that intervention, the death toll in Libya increased by a factor of between 10 and 20 times. The result of the intervention in Libya, the NATO bombing and bombardment and support of rebel forces in the civil war in Libya, the result of that has been 8,000 political prisoners, torture across the country, mass ethnic cleansing, the creation of warlord and militia regimes which is unable to run the country, and a managed election process which, if you look behind the curtain, really were not a genuine election, was not a genuine election process at all. And now we have the growing, creeping intervention in the horrific civil war in Syria, and the threat of an increased intervention through the channeling of weapons by the United States, Britain and France, in alliance with the Saudis and the Gulf dictatorships that Peter referred to particular factions in the opposition, increasing the bloodshed all the time. And in the last week, we've seen the Western powers trying to reshape and orchestrate who Syria's opposition is going to be on behalf of the Syrian people. And so there's not only a risk in Syria of massively increased bloodshed as a result of that intervention, but it's clear it's taking control of the country out of the hands of the Syrian people themselves. And in all this process, the media has played a key role in the rehabilitation of the new form of the war on terror, the portrayal of the Libyan rebels as heroes without qualification or without fact for most of the period of the uprising and the war, the non-reporting of some of the things I've been talking about, the mass ethnic cleansing, the atrocities that were carried out in Libya and also in Syria, and, for example, the Grozny-like destruction of the town of Sirte in northern Libya that took place last autumn in the final weeks of the campaign, which saw 500 civilians killed in a single week, according to Human Rights Watch, but was barely reported on the British or Western media at all. And in Syria, only the reporting of atrocities when it fits with the Western agenda, when they want to shift the arms supplies from one group to another. Now, public opinion has been actually quite resistant on coming round to support the wars in Syria or in the intervention in Libya or in Syria. And in the case of Iran, we have, as has already been said, a serious threat of war on almost exactly the same basis that was deceitfully and falsely advanced in the case of Iraq. But the media is continuing to play the role of trying to soften up public opinion so these interventions can take place. And in particular in the case of Afghanistan, where it's clear that it's a completely lost cause, the effort is to turn the campaign into a sort of support our troops message rather than support the occupation, which no one which a tiny minority in the country now do. And I think in foreign policy reporting in the media, it's crucial to understand that the central issue, and I think Peter already referred to this, is that foreign correspondence and foreign media coverage, and especially on the BBC, is guided overwhelmingly by the position of the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence. If you want to know, why the coverage is shifting this way or that way on Syria or Libya, you just want to look at the position of the British government and its international allies. Now, the same thing is now happening in Israel and Gaza. In the last few days, we've seen a portrayal of a brutal invasion and attack on the occupied people of Gaza as somehow an act of self-defense. The only people who are in a position of defending themselves in this conflict are the occupied people. The occupiers have an obligation to withdraw, and the resistance that takes place in Gaza against Israeli occupation is the real self-defense in this story. But in the way it's been reported, once again reflecting a harder line pro-Israel position of the British government, it's the opposite. Now, to summarize the picture, really, I think from Palestine to Pakistan, Libya to Iran, Afghanistan to Iraq, the Western-backed wars of intervention and occupations in the Arab and Muslim world are clearly not, throughout this period, being fought in defense of human rights, democracy, self-determination, the rights and lives of civilians, or even to combat terrorism. It's rather the opposite. They're being fought all throughout this period, however they're branded, to enforce Western control of resources in the Middle East and to save the credibility of NATO and Western power. And that's not just not in the interests of the people of the region, of Iraq, Afghanistan, people of the Arab and Muslim world, but it's not in our interests either. And so challenging the media sanitization and state propaganda that we've been talking about today is an essential part of the battle to end these disastrous wars and interventions, bring the troops home, and allow the peoples of the region to determine their own future. Thanks very much.